Sir, we got a call about someone who looked like they belonged here. I need to see some ID.
I live here. I'm literally washing my car in my own driveway.
Just cooperate and we'll be done here.
You're really going to do this?
Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be.
I'm Sergeant Darnell Whitmore. I'm sure you recognize my name. Now I need your
badge number because you're in big trouble.
The silence that came next lasted exactly 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds, Officer Trevor Castellano's whole world fell apart. The man he had just told to cooperate, the person he had quietly judged as someone who didn't seem to belong there, was not just a regular citizen. He was a 15-year veteran of the police department. He was a decorated sergeant, and as of 3 weeks ago, he was Castellano's direct supervisor in the East Division Patrol Unit. This was not going to be a simple call that Castellano could write up and forget by the end of his shift. This was going to be a career-ending moment, one that would be studied in police academies for years. And the worst part was that Castellano's own body camera was recording every single word that had just been said. Trevor Castellano had been with the police department for 4 years. He was 28 years old, married, and believed he was a good cop. He had grown up in a mostly white suburban neighborhood about 30 miles from the city where he now worked. His father had been a police officer, and from a young age, Castellano had wanted to follow the same path. He went through the police academy, graduated somewhere in the middle of his class, and was assigned to the East Division. His record looked solid on paper. He had earned 14 commendations for good police work. He had made several strong arrests, helped with community events, and his supervisors had always rated him as capable and dependable. But there was another part of Castellano's file that had never really been dealt with. Over his 4 years on the force, Castellano had received 9 complaints from citizens accusing him of racial profiling or inappropriate behavior. Every one of those complaints had come from Black or Latino residents. All 9 had been investigated and officially labeled as unfounded or unsubstantiated. Those investigations were handled by his previous supervisor, Lieutenant Vernon Kowalski, a man known for protecting his officers and brushing off most civilian complaints as attempts to escape justified police action. Kowalski had retired 6 months earlier. The new supervisor assigned to Castellano's unit was someone from another division, someone Castellano had never worked under before. That supervisor was Darnell Whitmore. Darnell Whitmore was 38 years old and had spent 15 years with the department. He had started his career as a patrol officer, worked his way up to detective, and later moved into a supervisory role. His record was outstanding. He had received 2 medals of valor for bravery under fire, solved dozens of major cases, and had a reputation for being strict but fair. For the past 5 years, Whitmore had lived in the Riverside neighborhood, one of the nicer areas in the city. His home was a well-kept 3-bedroom craftsman-style house with a detached garage and a small front yard. The neighborhood was mostly white, upper-middle class, quiet and peaceful. Whitmore had moved there with his wife and their 2 daughters, and he truly liked the area. The schools were good, crime was low, and most of the neighbors were friendly. When he first moved in, Whitmore made sure to introduce himself to everyone on the block. Most people were welcoming. A few looked surprised to see a Black family moving into the neighborhood, but Whitmore was used to that kind of reaction. He focused on being a good neighbor and chose not to let it bother him. That Saturday morning in November, Whitmore was off duty. He decided it was a good time to wash his car, a dark blue sedan that had gotten dirty after a full week of rain. He pulled the car into the driveway, grabbed a bucket and sponge, and began washing it. The weather was perfect. The temperature was in the mid-60s, the sun was out, and there was a light breeze in the air. Whitmore was dressed casually in jeans, a gray t-shirt, and old sneakers. He had his earbuds in, listening to music while he worked. He was completely at ease, enjoying his day off, and thinking about taking his daughters to the park later that afternoon. He never heard the patrol car pull up behind him. Castellano was driving through the Riverside neighborhood on a routine patrol when his radio crackled to life. Dispatch reported a call about a suspicious person in the 2400 block of Maple Street. The caller, who chose to stay anonymous, said there was a Black male acting suspiciously around vehicles. Castellano responded that he would handle it. He drove over to Maple Street and began scanning the area for someone who matched the description. That's when he noticed Whitmore in a driveway calmly washing a car. In just a few seconds, Castellano made several assumptions. First, he assumed Whitmore didn't live there. The neighborhood looked too nice, too expensive. Second, he assumed Whitmore might be checking cars to break into them. Third, he assumed this had to be the suspicious person the caller mentioned. Castellano never considered that Whitmore might actually live in the house. He never considered that washing your own car in your own driveway on a Saturday morning is about as normal as it gets. He didn't think to call dispatch back for more details. Instead, he stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward Whitmore with his hand resting on his service weapon. Before we go on, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you appreciate stories that expose the reality of racial profiling, even inside law enforcement, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. What happens next is going to shock you. Whitmore didn't notice Castellano until the officer was about 10 feet away. He pulled one earbud out and turned around. That's when he saw a uniformed officer approaching with a serious look on his face and a hand near his weapon. Whitmore's first thought was that something had happened nearby. Maybe there had been a break-in, maybe an accident. He turned off the hose and walked toward Castellano, expecting a professional conversation between two law enforcement officers, even though Castellano had no idea who he was yet. But Castellano didn't start with professionalism. His first words came out as an accusation disguised as a demand. He said they had received a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged there, and he needed to see some ID. The words hit Whitmore hard. Someone who didn't look like they belonged. Not someone committing a crime, not someone matching a suspect description. Just someone who didn't look like they belonged in that neighborhood. Whitmore kept his voice calm and stated the obvious. He said he lived there. He was washing his car in his own driveway. It was a simple fact, one that should have ended the interaction immediately, but Castellano didn't apologize. He didn't step back. He didn't rethink his actions. Instead, he told Whitmore to cooperate, and they'd be done. The message was clear, as if Whitmore was the problem. As if simply being a black man in a white neighborhood meant you owed the police compliance, even without a reason. Whitmore then asked the question hanging in the air. You're really going to do this? It wasn't just about the ID. It was about whether Castellano was really going to continue obvious racial profiling, whether he was actually going to stop someone for no reason other than race. Castellano's reply answered that question. He told Whitmore not to make this harder than it needed to be. The meaning was obvious. Don't question. Don't push back. Don't assert your rights. Just comply, whether the demand is legal or not. That's when Whitmore made his decision. He identified himself. He stated his name and rank, and added that he was sure Castellano recognized it. From the look on Castellano's face, it was clear that he didn't. Then Whitmore asked for Castellano's badge number, and calmly informed him that he was in serious trouble. You could see the change instantly on the body camera footage. Castellano's face shifted from confident authority to complete shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hand dropped away from his weapon. He even took an unconscious step backward. Whitmore let the silence sit for a moment. Then he spoke again, calm but firm, his voice edged with steel. He asked for Castellano's badge number. Castellano, still stunned, stuttered out 2,847. Whitmore then asked Castellano to explain exactly what reasonable suspicion he had to stop someone who was washing a car in their own driveway. What part of the call justified this stop? Castellano tried to regain control. He said he received a call about someone acting suspicious. Whitmore asked what the call actually said. Castellano repeated that the person didn't look like they belonged. Whitmore pushed harder. What made them suspicious? What crime had been reported? Castellano had no answer that didn't point directly to racial profiling. No crime was reported. No suspicious behavior was observed. He had simply been told someone didn't look like they belonged, and he had seen a black man washing a car. Whitmore then asked if Castellano had verified the address of the complaint. He hadn't. He asked if Castellano had called dispatch for additional details. Castellano hadn't done that either. Castellano hadn't. Whitmore asked if Castellano had seen any real criminal behavior before walking up. Castellano hadn't. Then Whitmore asked the question that would later become the main focus of the investigation. He asked Castellano if the only reason for this stop was that Whitmore was a black man in a mostly white neighborhood, and if that was what didn't look like they belonged really meant. Castellano tried to deny it. He said it wasn't about race. He said he was just responding to a call. Someone had reported a suspicious person. Whitmore didn't let him slide away from it. He pressed him again. What was suspicious? And that's where Castellano got stuck. Because the caller hadn't described any crime. All they said was, someone didn't look like they belonged. Castellano couldn't turn that into reasonable suspicion without admitting the truth, that the stop was based on race. So Castellano tried to switch the topic. He told Whitmore to just cooperate, and this would be over. Whitmore's answer was cold and direct. He pointed out that just cooperate is not a legal reason to detain someone. Officers need reasonable suspicion, and Castellano still couldn't name any. The interaction went on for another 6 minutes. Whitmore calmly and carefully walked Castellano through every mistake he had made, every assumption, every policy violation, and every constitutional problem. He explained that didn't look like they belonged is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. He explained that being black in a white neighborhood is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. He explained that anonymous calls with no clear criminal activity do not justify stops unless the officer verifies something on their own. Quick question for you watching: if you've ever been profiled by police even though you were doing nothing wrong, type "it happens" in the comments. Let's show how common this really is. Castellano tried a few different ways to downplay what he had done. He said he was just following up on a call and doing his job. Whitmore pointed out that doing your job means investigating correctly, not making assumptions based on race. Castellano said the caller sounded concerned. Whitmore asked what the specific concern was. Castellano couldn't name anything besides someone not belonging. Castellano then tried another angle. He said Whitmore should understand, officer to officer, that sometimes you have to make quick judgments. Whitmore told him that quick judgments based only on race are still racial profiling, and they're still unconstitutional, cop or not. By the end of that conversation, Castellano knew he was in serious trouble. Whitmore told him to return to the station and report straight to the watch commander. Whitmore also said he would be filing a formal complaint and starting an internal investigation. Castellano's body camera recorded the whole thing, and Whitmore had also recorded part of the interaction on his personal phone. Castellano drove back to the station in shock. He had just tried to threaten and control his own sergeant. He had carried out obvious racial profiling, and it was all documented. There was no clean way to explain it away. When Castellano got to the station, the watch commander was already waiting for him. The news had spread quickly. Whitmore had called ahead. Castellano was immediately placed on administrative leave while the investigation moved forward. His badge and weapon were taken from him. He was sent home with strict instructions not to talk about the case with anyone. The investigation started that same day. Internal Affairs assigned 2 senior investigators. The first thing they reviewed was Castellano's body camera footage, and the video was brutal. You could clearly hear Castellano's exact words. "We got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here." You could hear Whitmore calmly saying he lived there and was washing his car in his own driveway. You could hear Castellano telling him to just cooperate even though he had no legal reason for the stop. The audio also captured Whitmore's controlled anger when he asked, "You're really going to do this?" And then it captured the moment everything changed when Whitmore identified himself as Sergeant Darnell Whitmore and told Castellano he was in big trouble. The investigators then pulled Castellano's personnel file and found the 9 previous complaints. Now they had context. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This looked like a pattern that had been ignored for years. They interviewed Whitmore in detail. Whitmore gave a clear, thorough statement. He explained that he had experienced profiling before as a civilian, but being profiled by one of his own officers while off-duty was especially disturbing. He said it raised serious concerns about Castellano's judgment and whether Castellano had been profiling people throughout his career. Interviewed Castellano 3 days later. Castellano tried to defend himself. He said he was responding to a legitimate call. When investigators pointed out that the call gave no specific details and no real description beyond black male, Castellano said he had to make a judgment call. The investigators asked him why he assumed Whitmore was the person from the call when Whitmore was clearly just washing a car in a residential driveway. Castellano said the caller had reported someone who didn't look like they belonged. When investigators pushed him to explain what that actually meant, Castellano couldn't say anything that didn't boil down to race. They then asked Castellano what he meant when he told Whitmore to just cooperate. Castellano claimed he was trying to de-escalate the situation. The investigators corrected him immediately. Demanding identification without legal justification is not de-escalation. It escalates the situation. It violates a person's rights. They asked Castellano whether he knew Whitmore was a sergeant when he approached him. Castellano said no. They then asked if knowing that would have changed how he acted. Castellano answered that it probably would have. That answer revealed everything. It showed that Castellano would have treated a white homeowner differently. It showed that his actions were based on assumptions about who belonged in the neighborhood, not on any actual suspicious behavior. The investigators reviewed the original call to dispatch. The anonymous caller had simply said there was a black male on Maple Street who didn't look like he belonged and was acting suspicious around cars. The caller gave no exact address. No criminal behavior was described. No details were provided beyond race, a vague location, and the loaded phrase didn't look like he belonged. In other words, this was a textbook example of a racially biased call. The kind officers are trained to handle carefully, not rush into. Anonymous calls that combine race with phrases like doesn't belong and no specific criminal activity often come from people whose bias causes them to view any person of color as suspicious. Castellano should have asked for more information. He should have observed from a distance. He should have looked for actual criminal behavior. Instead, he saw a black man and assumed that was the problem. The investigators uncovered something even more troubling. They pulled dispatch records covering Castellano's entire 4-year career and found a clear pattern. Castellano had responded to suspicious person calls at a rate 40% higher than other officers in his district, and 87% of those calls involved people of color. That left only two possibilities. Either Castellano was somehow assigned to an area with unusually high suspicious activity by people of color, or Castellano was actively seeking out calls that allowed him to stop people of color. The data pointed strongly to the second explanation. Do you think the department should have caught this pattern earlier? Let me know what you think in the comments. The investigation lasted 7 weeks. During that time, investigators conducted 23 interviews, reviewed 14 hours of body camera footage from Castellano's past stops, and analyzed 4 years of dispatch records and incident reports. Their conclusion was clear and unavoidable. Castellano had violated department policy on racial profiling. He had conducted an investigatory stop without reasonable suspicion. He had failed to properly investigate before approaching a citizen. He had made decisions based on race rather than behavior. But the investigation revealed something bigger than one incident. Investigators tracked down the 9 people who had previously filed complaints against Castellano. 8 agreed to be interviewed. Their stories followed the same pattern. A 45-year-old black attorney, Jerome Buckley, described being stopped by Castellano while jogging in a park near his home. Castellano demanded ID and asked what Buckley was doing in the area. Buckley explained that he lived nearby and ran there 3 times a week. Castellano still made him wait while his ID was checked for warrants. There were none. Castellano let him go without explanation or apology. A 32-year-old Latina small business owner, Elena Fuentes, described being stopped while loading equipment into her van outside her own store. Castellano accused her of stealing and demanded receipts. Fuentes owned both the store and the equipment. She showed him her business license. Castellano claimed he was just being thorough. Her complaint was later marked unfounded. A 19-year-old black college student, Tyrell Washington, described being stopped while walking home from class at 8 p.m. Castellano asked where he was going, where he had been, and why he was in that neighborhood. Washington explained that he lived 3 blocks away. Castellano made him empty his backpack on the sidewalk. His complaint was investigated by Lieutenant Kowalski and dismissed as a lawful stop. The pattern was undeniable. Castellano repeatedly stopped people of color in situations that didn't justify police intervention. He repeatedly demanded identification without legal cause. He repeatedly treated people of color as if they were out of place. More importantly, investigators concluded that the 9 earlier complaints should never have been dismissed. A pattern review showed that every complaint described the same behavior. Castellano assuming people of color didn't belong, demanding ID without justification, and escalating situations that didn't require aggression. The investigation also exposed serious failures by Castellano's former supervisor, Lieutenant Kowalski. His reports used vague language like officer was conducting legitimate police work and complainant misunderstood procedures without actually evaluating whether the stops met constitutional standards. In 3 cases, Kowalski didn't even interview Castellano before closing the complaints. He simply accepted Castellano's reports as fact. In 2 other cases, he interviewed Castellano but failed to ask any meaningful questions about bias or justification. The investigators concluded that Kowalski either failed to recognize the pattern or recognized it and chose to ignore it. His lack of proper supervision allowed a problematic officer to violate citizens' rights for years. The recommendation was termination. Castellano's union fought the decision, arguing that he was responding to a legitimate call and that his actions, while aggressive, didn't justify being fired. The department's response was straightforward. Castellano had racially profiled his own sergeant. If he was willing to do that to a superior officer, what was he doing to ordinary citizens who had no power to push back? The union's argument failed. Castellano was terminated 9 weeks after the incident. His appeal was denied. His law enforcement career ended at 28 years old. But the impact didn't stop there. The department launched a full review of how civilian complaints had been handled. They examined 127 complaints investigated by Lieutenant Kowalski during his final 5 years. 94 involved allegations of discrimination or excessive force. Kowalski found merit in only 3. When Internal Affairs re-examined 30 of those cases using body camera footage and dispatch records Kowalski hadn't reviewed, they identified problematic behavior in 18 cases. The system hadn't just failed once, it had failed repeatedly. Officers were making stops without reasonable suspicion. Officers were using force in situations where it wasn't justified. Officers were making racially coded comments. Lieutenant Kowalski's failure to properly investigate complaints hadn't just protected Castellano. It had protected multiple officers whose behavior should have been addressed long ago. The department released a harsh report criticizing Kowalski's supervision. It stated clearly that his lack of proper investigations had allowed problematic conduct to continue unchecked throughout his division. Kowalski had retired 6 months before the Whitmore incident, so formal discipline was no longer possible. However, the department stripped him of the honors tied to his retirement ceremony in May. It clear that his legacy would be remembered as one of failed leadership, not service. Several community leaders publicly called for Kowalski to give up his pension, though legally that could not be done. Still, the message was clear: his actions, or lack of action, had caused real harm. In response, the department introduced sweeping new reforms based on the investigation's findings. Any complaint involving racial profiling would now be handled directly by Internal Affairs, not by division supervisors. This change removed the conflict of interest that had allowed supervisors like Kowalski to shield their officers. All police stops would now be reviewed quarterly to identify patterns of racial disparity. The department hired a full-time data analyst whose only job was to monitor stop data and flag officers whose patterns couldn't be explained by legitimate reason. Body camera footage from investigatory stops would now be randomly audited. Every month, 5% of all stops would be selected at random and reviewed by a team made up of supervisors and community representatives. The department also created a civilian review board with real authority. In the past, civilian oversight had only been advisory. The new board had the power to demand testimony, access all records, and make binding recommendations on discipline when complaints were sustained. Officers were now required to complete 16 hours of implicit bias training every year, replacing the old 2-hour online course that many officers rushed through without engagement. The new training was in-person, interactive, and built around realistic scenarios designed to force officers to confront their own biases. An early warning system was also put in place. If an officer received 3 complaints alleging similar behavior within a year, even if none were sustained, they would be automatically flagged for additional supervision and training before the behavior escalated further. Whitmore played a direct role in developing the new training program. He shared his own experience, including the body camera footage, as a teaching example. Officers watched a respected sergeant get racially profiled by one of their own. It was uncomfortable. And that was the point. The training didn't stop there. Officers were shown body camera footage from several of Castellano's earlier stops. They watched him stop the attorney who was jogging. They watched him harass the business owner outside her own store. They watched him force a college student to empty his backpack. After each clip, trainers asked a simple question: what reasonable suspicion did the officer have? The answer was always the same: none. The only thing linking the stops was the race of the person being stopped. Whitmore also became a strong advocate for officers of color within the department. As he spoke out, he learned he wasn't alone. Other black officers shared stories of being stopped while off-duty, questioned about why they were in certain neighborhoods and treated as suspects instead of fellow officers. Whitmore started a mentoring program that paired experienced officers of color with new recruits. He worked closely with command staff to address bias within the department and pushed for greater diversity in both hiring and promotions. The incident made it impossible to deny that these problems existed, even among those sworn to protect and serve. Whitmore was determined to help change that culture. Castellano's firing drew widespread media attention. Local news outlets covered the story of an officer terminated for profiling his own sergeant. The story spread rapidly on social media. Once the investigation concluded, the body camera footage was released and viewed millions of times. Comment sections filled with personal stories. Black professionals stopped in their own neighborhoods. Latino business owners questioned inside their own stores. Asian Americans followed by security in upscale shops. The story struck a nerve because it showed that profiling doesn't care about education, profession, or status. Even a decorated police sergeant wasn't immune. Castellano gave one interview after his termination. He claimed he had been treated unfairly and said he was just responding to a call and doing his job. When asked whether he understood why Whitmore had been offended, his hesitant response showed that he still didn't fully understand the issue. He never apologized, not privately, not publicly. 6 months later, Castellano moved out of state and took a construction job. His wife filed for divorce, citing the stress caused by his firing and his refusal to take responsibility for his actions. Whitmore continued his career. 3 years later, he was promoted to lieutenant. He became a respected voice within the Department on Community Relations and Fair Policing. The house on Maple Street is still his home. He still washes his car in the driveway on Saturday mornings. But now, when patrol cars drive by, officers wave. They know who he is, they know what happened, and they understand that assumptions based on race come with consequences. The incident became a powerful case study on how racial profiling can exist even inside institutions that should know better. It showed that having anti-discrimination policies means nothing if they aren't enforced. It showed that complaints must be taken seriously and patterns must be recognized early. Most importantly, it showed that racial profiling doesn't just harm the people being profiled. It destroys trust in law enforcement, damages departments, and ends careers when bias replaces judgment. That Saturday morning, Marcus Whitmore was doing what millions of people do every weekend, washing his car at home. The only thing that made him suspicious was the color of his skin, and the officer who couldn't see past that lost everything. The lesson is simple but powerful. When you assume someone doesn't belong because of their race, when you treat appearance as evidence, when you let bias guide your actions instead of facts, you aren't doing good police work, you're practicing discrimination. Eventually, no matter who the person is, a sergeant, a lawyer, a teacher, or a regular citizen, the truth comes out. The pattern becomes clear. The consequences become real. Castellano believed he was investigating a suspicious person. What he actually revealed was his own bias. He thought his badge gave him the authority to question anyone he believed looked out of place. What he learned was that looking out of place because of race is not reasonable suspicion. That body camera footage from November is still used in training sessions across the country, not just in police departments, but in discussions about implicit bias and racial profiling. Every time someone watches it, they see the exact moment an officer's career collapses. They see the realization. They hear the excuses fall apart. They witness accountability. If this story helped you understand how racial profiling really works, even inside law enforcement, please share it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and demand accountability. Drop a comment and share what you learned. Your engagement helps these stories reach the people who need to see them most. Thanks for watching till the end.